Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Wanted to talk today a little bit more about the Total Party System Fairy Tale Handbook. The premise here is I'm trying to get back to older fantasy tropes, stuff that predates Tolkien and Howard, and all the cynical baggage that comes with the 20th century version of the fantasy genre. Trying to get back more towards those essential Dark Age to Middle Age to early Renaissance period type storytelling. It's not an actual setting, it's a handbook. It gives you a bunch of information for making human characters from a medieval Dark Ages caste system with a heavy emphasis on characters that are affiliated with the church or Christianity. I break the class system down into your commoners at the bottom, which are split in between your basic peasants and wenches. You have the nobility, your lords and ladies. There's the religious class of the church, where you get clergy and maidens. There's two different types of magicians, wizards and witches. Wizards are kind of pseudo-nobility, whereas witches are pseudo-outlaws. And then there's, of course, the outlaw class, which exists outside of society because they're criminals or heretics or other rejects from society, rebels, revolutionaries, the whole kit and caboodle. Now, the fairy folk in this are very similar to, but not identical to, the fairy folk that are presented in some of my other games. As said, this is just a generic handbook so that game masters can create their own setting or set a fairy tale type role-playing game in a historical setting of their choice. That's appropriate. But it does not exist in the continuity of the other Total Party System game series. I break fairy folk down into 5 races. You have your elves, you have your pixies, you have your gnomes, you have your goblins, and you have your ogres. I also provide rules for 2 broad categories of other kinds of supernatural creatures that players could potentially be allowed to play with their game master's approval. These are broken down into fairy friends, or shapeshifters. Fairy friends include, Fae-adjacent type of fantasy races like your centaurs and your satyrs, swan maidens, mermaids, and cherubs. And for the shapeshifters, you get your classic werewolf, selkies, nymphs, cat sith, which were, the former familiars of wizards and witches who have learned magic and have shapeshifted themselves into humans. And then there's my version of Puka, which are people who've been cursed by the fairy to have animal heads. They're not able to talk, they're basically stuck that way, they're somewhat social outcasts, although people pity them. They're very underpowered, struggling type player characters. I'm sure people will like playing them. And then there's also some rules for your basic, most classic types of, monsters, fairy foes, as it were, that players can encounter, and a very large section on magic items that players could potentially get a hold of. Now, the Fairy Tale Handbook is not a complete role-playing game. You will need a copy of the Total Party System Rules Handbook. You can use the original generic version of the Total Party System Rules Handbook, although I did put out a streamlined fantasy edition of the Rules Handbook that works very well with this, as well as other, fantasy titles. Or you can use it to create a fantasy world of your own devising. It does include the basics on the cast-type human characters that you find in the Fairy Tales Handbook. Tonally, like a good fairy tale, the Fairy Tale Handbook is designed that it can either be kind of dark and creepy, or it can be played up to be a bit silly. It's formatted so you can have very much a lot of the classic adventure types that you have with Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasy role-playing games, but stripping away a lot of those tropes that emerged post the First World War. This is not an anime game of hack and slash where a lone fighter enters a cave and fights 100 goblins. Individual monsters are creepy and dangerous. And so there's a horror survival element to a good fairy tale role-playing game that, with any luck, the Fairy Tale Handbook will provide for you. So be sure to check it out on Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG. Links will be provided in the description box below. And as always, I'm King Waspinator, and I approve this message.